He told investigators he was just an ordinary guy who made some mistakes. But his mistakes were the bodies of women left in the woods and rivers by highways. He clocked in at work, ate dinner with his family, went to church, and then went back out to hunt. For nearly 20 years, police spent millions of dollars searching for a monster they imagined in their heads. And the entire time, the real killer was quietly painting trucks, paying his mortgage, and blending into the background. This isn't a recap of the Green River murders. This is a psychological autopsy of how one of America's most prolific serial killers hid in plain sight, and how our own mental shortcuts helped him do it. You're watching The Hidden Complex, a faceless true crime channel where we don't just ask how crimes happened, we ask why the system let them. If that's the version of true crime you want in your feed, you can subscribe at any point. Let's start with the man almost everyone underestimated. On paper, Gary Ridgway looked like the opposite of a Hollywood serial killer. He wasn't charming like Bundy, he wasn't theatrically intelligent like Hannibal Lecter, and he didn't leave elaborate signatures for investigators to decode. He was a short, soft-spoken truck painter with a reported second-grade reading level. He'd been married multiple times, had a son, owned a house, and kept a steady job. To neighbors he was forgettable. To co-workers he was just another guy on the line. To his family he was a husband and a father. Psychologically, that plainness mattered. We like to believe that evil will look a certain way: intense eyes, strange behavior, obvious rage simmering under the surface. Ridgway weaponized the opposite: low effect, predictability, routine. His violence wasn't impulsive, explosive chaos. It was instrumental, goal-oriented. A task to be completed. He developed a ritual: pick up a vulnerable woman, usually a sex worker, or runaway. Drive her to a secluded area. Strangle her. Dispose of the body. Then go home and resume the performance of normal life. No grand manifesto. No taunting letters. Just repeated, quiet predation. From a psychological perspective, that's important. His killings became a kind of dark routine, an extension of his need for control, power, and sexual dominance, folded into his weekly schedule like another chore. Now look at who he chose as victims. He targeted women the system already saw as disposable. Sex workers, marginalized women, people with unstable housing or support. By choosing people who were already stigmatized, he exploited two layers of psychology. First, his own moral disengagement. He could tell himself they were bad women, that they deserved it, or that they were less than human. That kind of dehumanization makes it much easier to kill repeatedly. Second, institutional bias. When a society quietly values some lives more than others, predators notice. The slower the system is to respond, the safer the killer becomes. Ridgway didn't need to outsmart the police in a classic cat-and-mouse game. He only needed to stay boring enough that nobody looked too closely. And for a very long time that worked. To understand why he got away with this for so long, you have to look at the psychology of the institutions chasing him. The Green River Task Force formed in the shadow of Ted Bundy. Bundy had become the archetype, the brilliant, manipulative, charismatic predator. So investigators carried that mental image into the new case. This is called a schema, a mental template we use to make sense of the world. Schemas are useful, but they're also dangerous when we force reality to fit them. The working idea of a serial killer at that time looked like this. A highly intelligent loner with a chaotic, obvious dark side who couldn't hold down a job or maintain any kind of normal family life. Gary Ridgway was almost the opposite on every point, and that mismatch bought him time. Then there was the official psychological profile. Early on, the killer was described as disorganized, transient, driven by uncontrollable rage. Ridgway was organized. He stayed local. He repeated patterns. He was methodical. Once a profile like that is written, it doesn't just sit in a file. It shapes perception. Leads that don't fit get quietly deprioritized. Suspects who don't match the image get pushed to the back of the line. That's profile bias. And it's not just about one case. It's how large systems protect their own story about what they're looking for. Then there's one of the most infamous moments in this investigation, the polygraph. Ridgway was on the radar. He was interviewed. He agreed to a lie detector test. And he passed. That single word, passed, functioned like a psychological shield around him for years. But here's the problem. Polygraphs don't actually detect lies. They detect stress, changes in heart rate, breathing, sweat. If someone is emotionally detached, practiced at lying, or simply doesn't experience intense guilt the way most people do, the polygraph becomes almost meaningless. Yet, at an institutional level, polygraphs feel scientific. They produce charts, numbers, visible spikes. And when a tool feels objective, people are more likely to overtrust it. So when the machine said no deception indicated, it allowed investigators to relax around Ridgway. He didn't match the profile. He didn't trip the machine. He could be moved lower on the list. For years, his name would resurface, be looked at, and then put aside. Even when they collected physical evidence, samples, fibers, items from his home, the available technology wasn't ready to make the connections. That created another psychological trap for the system: cognitive dissonance. We suspected him. We tested what we had. Nothing proved it at the time. So maybe our instincts were wrong. And when institutions experience that kind of dissonance between suspicion and lack of confirmation, they often resolve it by downgrading the suspicion, not by questioning their tools or assumptions. The result? The investigation kept moving. Ridgway kept killing. And the gap between what he really was and what the system could imagine a killer to be kept growing. What ultimately caught Gary Ridgway wasn't a sudden stroke of human insight. It was time, and technology slowly catching up to the reality of what he'd done. As DNA testing improved in the 1990s and early 2000s, old evidence from the Green River case was retested. Biological material that had once been inconclusive could now be compared with a much higher degree of certainty. In 2001, new tests finally linked Ridgway to several victims. The invisible man, the ordinary guy, was suddenly tethered to the crime scenes by something he couldn't talk his way around. What's revealing here is that the psychological breakthrough wasn't about understanding him differently. It was about finally having hard data that the system would accept as undeniable. Once arrested, Ridgway eventually confessed to dozens of murders. When he described his actions, it wasn't with theatrical rage or dramatic remorse. He talked about opportunities. He talked about problems to be taken care of. He talked about driving by sites later to revisit what he'd done. That language shows classic moral disengagement. Victims become objects. Their suffering is erased from the narrative. The focus is on his logistics, his needs, his compulsion. Over time, his crimes had become normalized to him. There's a concept in safety research called normalization of deviance. When a dangerous behavior is repeated so often without immediate consequences that it starts to feel acceptable, routine. For Ridgway, killing became that. A dark, secret habit rewarded by the fact that he kept getting away with it. For the system, there was a different kind of normalization. Bodies kept appearing. The case dragged on. Task forces were formed, reformed, budgets shifted, leads came and went. When something horrifying becomes part of the background for long enough, even institutions start to treat it as a kind of ongoing problem, rather than an emergency demanding radical rethinking. In the end, it wasn't that he outwitted the system at every turn. It was that his particular form of evil, quiet, repetitive, directed at marginalized victims, slipped through the cracks in how that system thought. The Green River case is often told as a story about one monstrous man. But there's another layer, what it reveals about our psychology as a society, and as true crime consumers. We like villains who stand out. We want to believe that you can just tell when someone is dangerous. That behind every serial killer there's a dramatic red flag we would easily spot. Ridgway forces us to confront the opposite. He blended in. He maintained relationships. He looked, worked, and behaved like thousands of other men in his community. That challenges our representativeness bias, our tendency to judge likelihood based on how well someone fits our mental stereotype. If a man looks like our image of a serial killer, we're primed to see danger. If he looks like a quiet neighbor, we're primed to see safety. Then there's how we collectively viewed his victims. When victims are sex workers, addicts, runaways, or people living on the margins, their disappearances don't trigger the same emotional response in the public, or in the media, as missing children from suburbs or middle-class families. That asymmetry in attention feeds back into police pressure, political will, and resource allocation. It's not that individual detectives don't care. Many did. It's that the surrounding system reacts more strongly to some victims than others. Predators like Ridgway sense that hierarchy. Whether consciously or not, they learn where the response will be slowest, where people are least likely to be believed, where families have the least power to demand answers. So when we look at this case, we're not just seeing one man's pathology. We're seeing a map of who our culture protects fastest, and who it doesn't. Gary Ridgway called himself an ordinary man who made mistakes. That language is almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves, because it tells us two things. First, how thoroughly he dehumanized his victims, enough to compress torture and murder into the word mistake. And second, how ordinary evil can look from the outside when our mental models are wrong, our systems are biased, and our attention is unevenly distributed. In this breakdown, we looked at 3 layers: the individual psychology, a controlled, emotionally detached predator who turned killing into routine; the institutional psychology, a system chasing the wrong archetype, overtrusting its tools, and undervaluing its most vulnerable victims; and our psychology as viewers, the comforting myths we tell ourselves about what evil looks like, and who deserves urgent protection. On this channel, that's the pattern we come back to, not just the crime but the hidden complex of minds and systems around it. If you want more true crime that asks, how did this happen? And why did everyone miss it for so long? Instead of just replaying the headlines, this is your invitation to stay. You can subscribe to The Hidden Complex and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next psychological autopsy, where we'll look at another case that exposes the gap between the monsters we imagine and the ones we actually create. In the meantime, I want to hear from you. What do you think was the single biggest failure in the Green River investigation? The profile, the polygraph, or the way the victims were viewed? Let me know in the comments. I read every one, and your perspective helps shape which cases we dissect next. Thanks for watching. Stay curious and stay critical of the stories we accept about crime, justice, and the people we choose not to see.